Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'll be very brief. I know we're running behind schedule. The topic of my presentation is how are we looking at decarbonizing India's transport. And I would largely be focusing on the issue of road transportation. So just to put some context, roughly about quarter of emission world over greenhouse gas comes from transport sector. In India, that number is about 15 odd percent, 14, 15%, depending on what study you take. But that's road transportation emission or transportation sector and emission in India is the fastest growing segment. And therefore, as we look at decarbonizing transport, I think it will be important for us to how do we look at decarbonizing road transportation in the Indian context. Now, the reason I wanted to paint this picture was that also within the road transport sector, we are looking at, while globally almost 40 odd percent emission comes from light duty vehicle segment, followed by heavy duty vehicle segment. In India, that number is slightly skewed, again, slightly complicated. I don't know if it is visible, but within the road transport sector, roughly 50% of the emission is coming from trucks, medium and heavy duty vehicles. Another 15-20% is from buses. We have cars and two-wheelers and three-wheelers are roughly about 14 to 15%. So the bottom line is, if we have to clean the transport system in India, road-based transport system, I think we have to do something about trucks. And that's a big, big issue because roughly about half of the emission is coming from them. While on the two-wheeler and three-wheeler front, a lot of action is happening, especially with the electrification. And then there is this whole issue of cars as well. And again, what do you do with the cars is also tricky because there is also question of equity which comes in. Do you really want to subsidize clean cars, or you want to encourage more clean public transport? And that's a slightly tricky conversation. But I think there is also a life beyond just greenhouse gas emission to road transport sector, and that is also very important for us to understand as we develop some strategies around it. And one important issue is the whole issue of the energy security. And again, 90% or close to 90% of the crude oil that we use is imported, and therefore as we move forward, and again this whole push towards Atmanirbharta or self-reliance, what is it that we can do to address this issue of energy security is going to be important. But also what will be important is that it's also very important from the public health perspective. And again, the so-called pollution season in Delhi has just started, and in a couple of weeks' time, we will see everything, most of the conversation in Delhi at least, revolving around what do you do with terms like particulate matter emission, PM 2.5 will be in the news, PM 10 will be in the news, NOx, SOx, all kinds of conversation will happen. And this is really important for us because, as I said, we did some studies to understand what is the public health impact of transport vehicle exhaust emission. And we found that India roughly loses 74 to 75,000 lives every year. These are premature deaths which are directly attributable to what comes out from the transport vehicle exhaust. So, and again, if you look at some of these emission, NOx is a very, very high source from transport, and so is the case with particulate matter, PM 2.5 emission. So with that as a background, the question is, what do we do? And I think this is something that we did a long back, an analysis to understand if we have to look at achieving near zero greenhouse gas emission with all possible powertrain technologies available, what technologies will deliver on the climate goal? It's a question that was posed to us as a group, and we tried to answer it. And we looked at all possible fuels as well. And we concluded that there are only two technologies that can deliver on climate goal. And incidentally, they also have a very strong co-benefit on public health as well. One is the battery electric, and second is the hydrogen fuel cell. Now, with this in mind, the question was, how clean are these technologies? And what's the future of these technologies, especially in a country like India? And I'll come to that why it is really important. So as we move forward, and from 2021 number, if we move to 2030 at a global level, and then if we see the clean energy grid which is happening, the renewable uptake which is happening, we realize that these technologies, both hydrogen fuel cell as well as battery electric, will be cleaner. So the main takeaway was we now know a pathway, and the pathway to clean road transport actually revolves around electrification, which means that you generate green electrons through renewable sources, and then you have two options with these green electrons. Either you store them in battery and they power battery electric vehicles, that's one option, or you use these green electrons to generate green molecules, which is green hydrogen, and use that green hydrogen in the form of fuel cell to power, to again convert into clean electrons and then power the future. So this, we believe, are the two technologies that can deliver on the climate commitment. The question is, how does this technology relate to us in India when close to 70% energy, electricity, is coming from fossil fuel? So we did this again, well-to-wheel analysis, and we found that even with India's grid, which is predominantly relying on coal or fossil fuel, electric two-wheeler is cleaner in terms of well-to-wheel analysis by almost anywhere between 33 to 50%. An electric car is cleaner roughly around 20-odd%. But that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is, as we move forward and start cleaning the grid, and we have committed that by 2030, 50% of our energy will come from non-fossil fuel sources. In that scenario, what we realize that these two technologies will be cleaner as we move forward. So the bottom line is, we realistically can't decarbonize with internal combustion engine. We have to move forward, but all the change will not happen tomorrow or next year or next 5 years. There will be certain transitional fuels which will be there, and this is where something like biogas and other gaseous fuels can come in. But the long-term trend that we see is moving towards zero-emission vehicles, be it battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. Now, this is just the last slide, and I'll end this with this, that even with this aggressive electrification and aggressive policies around electrification, we might reach to a 1.8 or 1.85 degree scenario by 2050. We would still not meet the 1.5 degree scenario. And therefore, in order to meet the 1.5 degree scenario, we also have to go beyond just cleaning the technologies. We also have to look at how do we also reduce the travel demand. And that is where a lot of avoid shift policies will come in. How do you create cities which don't require, which are not dependent on long distance motorized travel? How do you create cities where walking, cycling is much more, which happens not by compulsion but by choice? How do you create that 75% of urban infrastructure which is yet to be built in India is built on the sustainable principle? I think that's a very tricky part to figure out, and we'll have to do. Only then we can achieve this 1.5 degree scenario. With this, I'll end my presentation, and sorry for rushing in, but I know we're running short of time.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you. Very nice presentation. You can leave the last slide there. And I'm sure this would provoke all the participants for some questions. Any questions? This gentleman first on this side.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Srinivasara from IIT Kharagpur. So actually, as we are moving towards hydrogen and battery vehicles, how about the safety? Because in well-developed countries nowadays, we are we can observe the couple of accidents in a year itself. So country like in India, in safety point of view, like we cannot take much factor of safety. Because our
Okay. So anything on safety aspects?
No, absolutely. I think it's a very valid question. And I think you saw last year a lot of news articles around electric two-wheelers catching fire. And again, as you bring in new technologies, this will become an issue. And I think what we have to, and which is what the government did very well, is to bring in a place where safety becomes a prime important, and you test these technologies against safety. Ever since the new regulations came out, the incident of fires in electric vehicles have gone on dramatically. And this is what we have to preempt. And if you remember about 20 years back, when CNG came in, there were a lot of issues. But there are some initial teething trouble. But once we have regulation that takes care of safety, I think some of these questions will be addressed.
Yeah, in addition to that, if you wanted to operate with hydrogen, we need a huge money for infrastructure as well as a change in engine design and all these things. Instead of that, can we go for ammonia? Directly into IC engines, means instead of focusing directly on H2 production and its storage, transportation and all, like it requires, like I'm working in ammonia combustion, so in my perspective way, like I think instead of going for all these things, we can focus on ammonia combustion technology, so that directly there is no much change is required for infrastructure especially.
No, absolutely. It's a good question on the funding and the finance involved. And that's why we think the bulk of this electrification journey will be delivered through battery electric vehicles. There will be certain use cases where hydrogen will come in. But we believe, and this is our analysis, that bulk of this journey will be through the battery electric vehicles.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
My question is on battery electric. This battery needs to be charged, and again it needs electricity. So how it is going to solve? Because again, production of electricity will be polluting.
Good question, sir. And that's what I said. If you look at the well-to-wheel analysis, and this is what we did, that we found that if you look at the well-to-wheel analysis, even with electricity in India, which is produced predominantly from fossil fuel, the life cycle emission of these vehicles are less. That's only one part. But as the country embarks on massive renewable uptake, the grid intensity factor will definitely come down, and we will have much cleaner energy. So there is a pathway, and the pathway is produce more renewables, use that renewables to power your vehicle, and that's the pathway. And incidentally, this facility is run through grid. It can also run through generator. But I know what will happen if we start having generators everywhere in our houses, in our cities. So I think it's time that we should move these generators also away from our vehicles. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Do you think that this battery can be charged by solar electricity?
It can be charged, but for a smaller form factors, for larger form factors, we will require much larger energy. And therefore, the better option is you produce renewables, pump them in the grid, you develop policies where you encourage battery electric vehicles to be charged when the renewable energy is high. And which we can do it by having variable tariff on charging.
We can work on increasing the efficiency of photovoltaics.
Absolutely.
Yes. So that can solve our problem.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you have a question here? Here, please. Incidentally, the focus on renewables and the target set by the government by 2030, they may have almost about 50% of the power from the renewals. I think that would address to some extent this thing, and renewable energy would be naturally required. Otherwise, how do you really decrease the carbon footprint if you are burning coal and generating power that doesn't serve the purpose,
Absolutely.
So I think that's the natural way of going ahead, and that's a trend we see in our country as well. Yeah, please.
Okay, so it was interesting to see a well-to-wheel analysis, but we have other organizations in the country and elsewhere who had slightly contrary results, maybe based on assumptions. So I was just interested to know, like, what kind of software, like, was it made in GREET, SIMA-Pro, that was used to do your well-to-wheel life cycle assessment, or was that in-house calculations? So if you can shed some more light on this.
No, absolutely. So we did use, and this our report is available on the web. You can take a look at it.
Okay. So it was your own in-house calculations?
Yeah.
No commercial software?
No commercial software we have used, but what we are, and since we came to know about some of these studies that have come, which have slightly different, and then I'm not saying whether they are right or wrong,
Sure.
but now what we are starting to do is do a meta-analysis to understand some of these studies which have a different result. Some of the recent ITF and World Bank study which also came, which also is in line with our study. So in 4 to 5 months, we will come up with a meta-analysis to understand what assumptions
Because
make
that would have a drastic effect.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so are these assumptions right or wrong? And then once you change the assumptions, what scenarios? So this meta-analysis that we are doing, in 4 or 5 months' time, this study will come out, and I'll be happy to share a copy
Oh,
of that study.
that's great.
Yeah, thank you.
And one small question as well, like this is something my friends have also asked, like with respect to infrastructure, like even if you talk about EVs, you talk about hydrogen, the infrastructure is sort of a bottleneck. Like in a city like Delhi where you don't have place to park your vehicle, like I sometimes get disturbed, like how are you going to charge your vehicles, like through slow charging or fast charging? And like, how do you see maybe after 50 years, like how the infrastructure would have changed, or like what is your vision? Would it be battery swapping, maybe wireless charging? What is your vision for that?
So hydrogen is a question mark which we're still trying to figure out, and we don't have a complete answer. But on the battery electric, what we realize is that the bulk of charging will happen at home or workplaces,
Okay.
which means we have to rethink our parking. A parking with a 15 ampere plug to start with will solve a lot of problem around charging. For two-wheeler space where you don't even have a designated parking,
Yep.
swapping is something that is going to work very well in India, but there are issues around standardization of swapping. Once we are able to address this swapping standardization bit, I think swapping will take care of a lot of two-wheeler and three-wheeler. Whereas for four-wheelers, having parking with charging together is going to solve a lot of problem. Public charging, fast charging, I think maybe 10-15% is what it will be utilized. The bulk will happen at home or destination charging.
But would you be feasible for a city like Delhi, like where you don't have a lot of problem for parking? I think everyone will agree.
Now, there are several business models which are emerging. For example, a small solar player talking to a mall for rooftop rides and saying at no cost to you, and I'll put some charging stations here. All those who come for purchase and all put their cars for charging there, do something for a few hours and come back. And that's how this is. So these are the working models at several places, and that's what I think are going to come in time. And some more perhaps innovations on that. But one thing on that, you pointed out the trucks are the major problem areas. How are you really suggesting to address that actually?
So what we are seeing now, especially from Europe and US, electrification on trucks is also picking up. We are seeing battery electric trucks coming in. In Europe and US, at least the total cost of ownership is in favor of battery electric trucks. In India, the situation is slightly different because we have very underpowered trucks. The cost of trucks are much, much lower. So if I convert an existing truck in India to a battery electric, the cost will be 4 to 5 times more. So that's one part. The other part, our utilization level is very low. So on an average, the trucks in India per month do 2.5 to 3 trips only. And 2 to 3 weeks in a month, they are just parked, waiting to get entry for unloading and loading. With that utilization level, you can't have electric trucks running in India. So we'll have to look at larger logistics issue on how do you improve the throughput of the trucks.
So you have taken trucks as all those trucks which are run on diesel,
Yes,
but there are large number which are run on CNG.
CNG in Delhi and some of the other cities.
As well. Yeah. So you're trying to factor that also.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Good.